Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our panel today, Beyond the Campus Community Split, a conversation on effective partnerships. Today's series of talks is brought to you and us by the UC Humanities Consortium, and in particular with the participation of the University of California, San Diego, UC Irvine, and UC Riverside. I'd like to thank especially our directors, Catherine Henshaw from UCR, Judy Wu from UCI, and Nancy Kwok from UC San Diego for helping to pull together what I hope will be a fantastic, really dynamic and insightful conversation among four really amazing organizers, activists, cultural personalities, and community organizers. So our format for today is I'm going to briefly introduce just by name and organization each of our four speakers, who will then give a brief introduction of themselves, their organizational work, and then we'll have a little bit of a conversation back and forth. For those that are participating in the webinar, you can put comments or questions in the Q&A. We'll monitor those and use those to help guide and steer our conversation. So please do feel open to participating. We're anxious to hear from folks as we can. So I'm just going to take a second here to introduce four figures, two whom I know, two whom I'm meeting for the first time today. Our first is Khalid Alexander, who is here from Pillars of the Community, a Southeast San Diego-based community organization. Second is Anchi May, who works just down the street from where I live, but we haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet. Who's the founder and executive director of MAKE Projects, a nonprofit social enterprise that links food justice, job training, and other economic development opportunities for refugee communities in the San Diego area. Yusef Omowale, who is the director of the Southern California Library, a community center and archive located in South Los Angeles. And Christine Tran from the Vietnamese American Arts and Letters Association. So I'm going to pass over to Khalid for a little bit briefer, a little longer discussion of the work of Pillars. And from you, we'll pass over to Anchi and we'll go through all four. Thanks.
Thanks for the introduction. I'm going to start by admitting that I apparently wasn't paying as close attention in the check-in as I was supposed to. So how quick are our introductions?
Just a couple minutes.
I could do that.
Like a couple as in two.
So, I need extra instructions in that area. So thanks for, I'm thrilled to be on a panel with these, my co-panelists, and of course to be working again with you, Danny. My name is Khalid Alexander. I'm the founder and president of Pillars of the Community, which is a local organization that does our work mostly in Southeast San Diego, where we advocate for people who are targeted and negatively impacted by law enforcement. We kind of do this in two ways. One is that it's just kind of basic community building, and the other part is trying to implement policies both locally and statewide.
Anchi, I'll pass to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anchi May. I'm the founder and ED of MAKE Projects. MAKE is an acronym for Merging Agriculture, Kitchens, and Employment. We operate a nonprofit farm and pop-up cafe in North Park. And our work experience gives $15 an hour in real-world experience to our target community, which is lower income refugee and immigrant women and youth in San Diego. And then being located in North Park, it's really a very multicultural and inclusive environment. And we hope to just use food and culture and community as a way to educate San Diego about the amazing cultural and social assets that refugee and immigrant communities bring. And I'll pass the baton back to you, Danny, to pass the baton.
Fantastic, thank you. And over to you, Yusef.
Hello, my name is Yusef. I work at the Southern California Library. We're a library and archive located in South Central Los Angeles. document histories of struggle and fights for social justice. Yeah, thank you for being inviting me here.
And last but very much not least, Christine Tran.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for all of the work that you guys are doing in the community and at your universities. My name is Christine Tran. I am with the Vietnamese American Arts and Letters Association. Our mission is to connect and enrich communities through Vietnamese arts and culture. We've been around for about 30 years as a nonprofit organization, usually a volunteer run. And last year we had our first staff member, which is me. I'm currently the managing director, working under Executive Director Issa Lay. And we hold cultural events and for the community in Orange County and Los Angeles, holding events like the Viet Film Fest, which is the largest international Vietnamese film festival, and lots of art workshops for the community, and archiving and storytelling and oral history projects as well.
That's fantastic. Thank you all for, and I know I wanted to just start with kind of throwing a question out for folks to ping around. And if you chose to take it another direction, that's fine as well. But one of the reasons that we wanted to reach out to the four of you in particular is that each of your organizations and each of your organizational work involves very centrally ideas and scholarship, and sometimes the participation of people from the university world, and sometimes knowledge that's generated more organically or from the community and spread that way. So I just wanted to kind of start by asking how, if any way, have you worked with university people in the past? What did you feel like worked for you and your organization and your memberships? What didn't? So just as a kind of starting point there to ask about that. And I think folks can unmute themselves and go from there. We're all pretty old Zoom hands by now, so I'll recede into the background.
Well, I'll start. Oh, Anchi, did you want to start?
Go for it, Khalid. I heard you first.
I'm just not good with uncomfortable silences.
You go first and I'll go right after.
Yeah, so, frankly, the interactions that Pillars has had with universities has been varies from non-existent to disappointing. And the most kind of successful interactions have been with people from universities who are working with us based off personal relationships, more than based off of actual kind of programs that the university was encouraging. In fact, the only program that I can think of that we did with a university ended up being really transactional. And so they came in the community, they did a program, and then once the grant was up, that was kind of it. Maybe kind of hinting that, hey, if another grant comes on, maybe we'll value the relationship and the work that we did a little bit more. Having said that, there are a few, professors, for example, Dr. Danny Widener at San Diego State University. I think Dr. Roberto Hernandez does a lot of work in the community. At UCSD, Dr. Lily Irani has been really helpful in a lot of the work that we do, and Dr. Brian Cross as well. And I'm probably forgetting a couple of people, but I think the emphasis there is that the connections that we've had to the quote unquote university are the interpersonal, the personal connections that we've had with individuals who are willing to, who actually kind of didn't enter as academics or as scholars, but entered first as kind of human beings that were creating relationships with the people that were working on issues that they cared about. And rather than kind of coming in order to study or in order to teach, really entered in the community with the idea of learning and assisting. And so, those relationships have been enormously helpful in really all of the work that we're doing on a couple of reasons. One, bringing their expertise and understanding of the world and how things work that we often don't have, but also demystifying the university world and the world of, quote unquote, scholars and activists, and just presenting kind of scholarship and individuals who are teaching at these universities as human beings. And so because we encourage education, we encourage a lot of our folks to go to community college, to transfer to four-year universities, that really helps demystify this idea. I mean, particularly in San Diego, right, where UCSD up until recently has been kind of almost a castle on the hill, unreachable by the majority of San Diegans. I think, perhaps the new trolley stop will help address some of those issues, but that's been our overall experience. And with very few students at the four-year universities who become involved, again, because of their concern for the community and not necessarily with an idea of working with it. I'll say Andre Jones, who I know is a graduate from UCSD, and I think he's actually on here, is one of those few students who, while studying at UCSD, continue to be a part of the community and continue to do a number of different programs. So.
Yeah, I think I'll expand on what Khalid brought up first, which is that the relationships from between MAKE projects and departments, professors, where there was a real desire for applied learning, service learning, internships, practicums. I think it's whenever I see that there's a department or professor that really values the application of theory and ideas, that it's always worked out much better. I would say that the university, before MAKE Projects was MAKE Projects, we were part of the IRC, International Rescue Committee, a huge NGO for many years. And so I've had the experience of 10 years operating programming as a nonprofit, and there's an enormous, human resources with free interns, volunteers, the students in our programming that's invaluable as a nonprofit. So I think that's very important, and it has been a huge asset. And I think that it takes professors who value that, and then their students really, I think, show up and are part of our programming in very valuable ways. I think that there's sometimes evaluation components we've been, part of or had to have as part of federal grants. And then sometimes there's, research projects and different project, graduate or undergraduate. It's probably been a little bit more valuable at the graduate level with like business schools or like the USD Crop School of Social Innovation. I just had a 2-hour student final presentation with recommendations for MAKE projects. It took a lot of staff time to really help educate and give them the real context and unfiltered, just like I was as real and honest as I could about the realities. And so they came with very great, I think, suggestions as a result of that. But again, it takes really understanding the nuts and bolts of how do you put this work into practice with budgets and operations and logistics and the realities of doing work on the ground. And then it comes together really well. And if it doesn't, then you smile and nod and you get some great papers and, thank you very much. So that's what I think.
Christine, I saw you nodding at the comment in part about staff time. So
Yes. Well, as you know, for a lot of nonprofits, we do rely on our volunteer base, and it's so important to value their time and labor, going both ways from academia and like for the nonprofit itself, and the balance on acknowledging the volunteers' times as well. But I also wanted to think about, the comment that Khalid say that it really depends on interpersonal relationships from the university. We are very lucky to have a lot of academics on our board, and by having them on our board, we were able to not only use their networks, but use their institutional knowledge and apply that to our programs on the forefront. And, we've been able to make really great relationships with different organizations, using venues like UCI, the Humanities Center has always been a huge supporter of ours. We've been able to use their facilities to host film screenings or to host talks before the pandemic. We've been able to curate programs and work with on-campus clubs. But on the flip side, sometimes if it's related to a grant or something, it can feel transactional, right? Where the university steps in for the duration of a program, and then at the end, they kind of leave. And so I think one of the things that I would ask for from the university is a little bit more support, either on the administrative side when it comes to touching base with the nonprofit, or even helping us with surveys, or allowing your students to take more time to participate in these extracurricular volunteering opportunities or internships, rather than taking the in-class work home all the time.
I would echo the things that have been said so far. And I think starting with looking at the notion that campus and community are somehow distinct and separate. Community has kind of come to mean like other, in the same way ethnicity is everybody but not white people, that normalizes whiteness. And so the campus is also a community, even in the extent that there's workers that are being exploited, students that are unhoused, don't have enough food to eat. We worry just as much about our loved ones that teach on campus in terms of their vulnerability to premature death, just as we worry about, we have so many archives of faculty of color, Black faculty in particular, that have died prematurely from the stress of doing this work, that we always look out for our students and faculty and staff on campus. And so that's one piece. Also, I think today the staff and to some degree membership of so many nonprofits and social justice groups is dominated by students that have come out of universities and that are reproducing the logics of racial capitalism, neoliberalism, whatever you want to say. So I think the distinctions between community and campus, whatever that really means, is much more blurred than we'd like to think. And also that whether we choose to or not, like, we're impacted by this relationship. We're in the relationship. In our communities, the academy produces so many reports and studies and other things legitimize policing in our neighborhoods, public-private partnerships that sustain dispossession of people that we care about. And so I think that's really where we're coming, is that we're already in this relationship, whether we choose to be or not. We're already impacted in particularly a lot of negative ways by this relationship. And then within that space, there's a lot of kind of fugitive relationships we have with various individual faculty, as has been said, students and staff, that get resources out the door, that we also participate in these things. And so for us, it's really starting from the place that it's not a choice. It's more the choice. It's not a choice to be in the relationship. It's a choice of how are we going to be in the relationship.
I really appreciate what you say there, especially the acknowledgement that the life on campus is changing very rapidly and very dramatically. When I got started in my career, there weren't food banks on campuses. As you say, the issue of housing wasn't as front and central. And you can kind of see by, at least in the University of California system, and I saw that Dylan Rodriguez from UCR is on the attendees list, our real inability to gain any traction with our efforts to push the police off campus, which really revealed, I think, at the end of the day, how organizationally similar we are to the rest of the society. With that said, you did mention as well, Yusef, the idea that large numbers of the people who are the staff of many of these community organizations come out of the university context. So I wanted to ask a little, as somebody who is teaching students who go into this world, if there are things that you find yourselves as organizers and directors of these organizations having to help students unlearn as they come into what are working class communities, what are multiracial, multinational communities, multi-generational spaces where citizenship statuses are diverse and hard to always immediately grasp. So I'm just curious, for those of us who are in the sort of teaching trenches part of it, if you find time and again particular issues with the folks who, I don't want to say we're sending you, but the folks who we're helping to send out in the world with commitments, but maybe not always the optimal mix of skills to go with those commitments.
Is that, I guess I'll start there. I mean, on the most basic sense is being able to critically read the world. I think in response to the damage that the academy has done to what we call community work, often people come out of the universities and are uncritical when they come to community spaces. And that's particularly challenging because so much of the work that happens now is very reproducing the very conditions that harm us. And so learning to be more critical of what's going on, to think about what's happening in terms of the ways in which foundations determine the nature of work, corporations, et cetera. And also just not seeing that they have to necessarily come out to us and do missionary work, but there's also a lot of struggle on campus that can benefit communities, what students can do and scholars and academics can do. A lot of times we tell people like, hey, like your homie, like in your department is putting out this material that's harming our community, but they can't speak on it because of the power dynamics within the university. And it's like, you don't need to come and volunteer and stuff envelopes with us. You need to get at the other people in the university that are doing harm to our communities. And so there's a lot of organizing even to do within the campus that they don't even have to come to the community.
Other thoughts on this question?
I could talk about it briefly. Pillars in Southeast San Diego in general is very cautious of and wary of outsiders. So we actually don't have a very robust volunteer program and don't actively look for students and folks to be involved who aren't actually from there. And so the few people like Andre or Michael Odom, when they were students, now both are professors, they were already kind of a part of the community. They were coming in and being involved. And as I mentioned before, it's almost like the professors who we work with are kind of like working off the plantation, and the work that they're doing with us isn't, again, connected to the community itself. Those few times when we have actually had folks, it's difficult to, I think there's often students who haven't grown up in communities like Southeast San Diego can be shocked and surprised and don't fit in really well. But I think it's those students who, and I think that actually speaks more to the institutions themselves and their failures in recruiting. So there aren't a ton of people from Southeast San Diego who are going to UCSD, for example. There aren't a ton of people who have had similar circumstances. And then those few who are, when they're on campus, I think often instead of kind of being embraced and encouraged, instead feel kind of alienated. And so I think one of the things that, that successful professors, or again, if we're trying to get away from these labels like scholar, activist, student, community member, right? Like some of those more successful human beings who are more established on the universities, what they do is they find those students and they encourage them and then let them know about some of the things that are happening in the larger community. But if you yourself don't know what's happening in the larger community, it's very difficult to do that. I think the only institution that I've seen do that really successfully, again, my knowledge is very limited when it comes to San Diego, was at the University Cal State San Marcos, that had a program called the National Latino Research Center, I believe, that ran a very successful Universidad Popular and Homie Up program. I started recommending that students go there because I knew that they were, one, doing work in the community, two, were a part of the community, the larger community, and three, were actually working with and doing a lot of really positive things. Ironically, over the last 2 or 3 years, the university, and I don't know all of the details behind it, got rid of that program. and got rid of the people who were leading it. And again, without knowing the details, I don't know the details of how that came about and what that happened. What I do know is that it was an amazingly successful program that was doing amazing work, both on campus and off campus, and really doing what I think this conversation is meant to do, is to kind of bridge those worlds that have been created for us, often separate, and figuring out that as educators, as people who care about the world and the future for our students and ourselves and our families, how are we using our expertise in order to make the world a better place? So we've got a problem. We've got a problem, but we have a lot of amazing people who are working on that problem. And I think the question is, how do we get institutional work for those people, for those individuals, whether they're students from the community, whether they're professors and academics and scholars who are involved in it? How do we get institutional support for those people so that instead of being kind of having to do something on the side, or instead of being sidelined, or instead of programs being cut, we are actually embracing that as a way of diversifying education and really providing a real education to all of our students, as opposed to the one that can often be seen like a, ivory tower or something unattainable to most.
Christine, I wanted to ask a kind of a version of this question that's more specific to the Vietnamese community. I had a background at one point where I was very involved in Cuba and in organizing it in the Cuban community in the United States, which has some superficial similarities ideologically to how we traditionally think of the Vietnamese community as well. And I found that there was often a way that people who emerged from the university were cast in the community as outsiders ideologically. And so the university got kind of superimposed within the political debates within that community. Not so much in Miami, where the universities were more aligned with the traditional Cuban American community, but certainly in California and other places that happen to be. So I'm just curious a little bit in your work around arts and letters, but also in terms of organizing in a kind of progressive Vietnamese space, to what extent do you find scholars or their works or students or graduate students as playing a particular role in the political life internally in that in the community?
I think that's such a great question. I think one of the things I really wanted to highlight in response to the overarching theme here of unlearning is understanding that our communities are very nuanced and complex communities. And to answer that question, the Vietnamese community is very nuanced as well. And so as an organization, we do take a lot of time and intention to as we bring in students or as we bring in university interns and things like that, to really ask them the hard questions up front. How familiar are you with the political nuances of our community? How would you approach, if there's a piece of artwork that is being displayed and then the community wants to censor it? Our values as an organization is to not censor artists, right, and allow for that expression to exist. And so our history with the community has always been very nuanced, and we've navigated the waters in many ways. And in many moments, we do have educators and people in academia that really support our work. I don't think that they are cast in a different light per se, as you're describing with the community, the Cuban community, but I also think it's a generational thing from our community that as generations evolve and learn to talk to each other and communicate with each other, even older generations have to unlearn certain things, or the newer generation is teaching and unlearning as well.
Trying to unmute myself. We have a couple of other general questions, but I was writing down some notes as people were talking about their organizational lives. Anchi, and I wanted to ask you something specific as well, which popped up, which is, obviously in terms of Christine's work, arts and letters are in the organizational name. And I have some familiarity with both pillars and with the library, and know them as spaces of both a lot of historical knowledge and literary activity. But it seems like you're dealing with people who are coming out of some other fields, right? Agriculture, economic development, business, you mentioned. And so given that this is a kind of a humanities consortium event, I just wanted to hear your thoughts a little bit on what you've found organizationally useful about different disciplines, what you see that maybe humanities as capable of contributing to what is really practical work that you're doing with multiple tremendously underserved communities. So I'm just curious to hear a little bit your thoughts of how you navigate different kinds of knowledge production and traditions and scholarly fields.
That's a great angle I wasn't thinking of, but in some ways I had thought about. So my undergraduate degree was in social and cultural anthropology, and then I became an urban planner, and then nonprofit work. So it's been very applied for the last however many years. And also at Make Projects, our work is that we run a cafe. We run a social enterprise. So the value of academic connections have been very much related to the business operations. But I think that the idea of knowledge and knowledge production and academia does play into my work on a daily level because of maybe two general themes that I think my background in social cultural anthropology and it was a focus on globalization and the just the constant diversity of our global economy. So I think that I come to what we're trying to do, the mission, the idea of educating, the idea of, having our clients be able to express, articulate, having Make Projects educate beyond just the headlines of what political events bring refugees, but that Afghan food and history is far richer, but ironically way more globalized, and as with every cuisine around the world, right? So we use food, we use our platform to, I think, get at some of those more nuanced ideas that you get in academia, but it's very applied because you're not going to read a whole book about it. You're just going to come away, hopefully, with this idea that, wow, Afghanistan's not just a 20-year political turmoil. It is a woman there who is talking to me and a food that is familiar or not familiar, right? And it's applied that kind of theory. And I think that how we're trying to also educate is beyond like kind of anti-humanities in a way, not through theory and not through books, but through the experience, through meeting people, through the eating of the food, through, we had a Karen, Burmese Karen kind of weaving exhibit last October, and we worked with, the Burmese Karen residents of City Heights to produce some of the textiles and talk and hang it. And so it's very much coming from our clients, the knowledge. And so I like that they are the subject experts in a way, and we're trying to produce new knowledge, outside of academia in a way, but it's very much informed, right, by the fact that all of us have on staff, some connection to our own education and this general conversation, be it the media or academia as well.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you. I want to pause just for a sec and ask if there are specific points or reactions or ideas or thoughts that have come up in the course of the conversation that people want to speak to. We have, a list of things to talk about and with, but I want to make sure I'm not jumping over anybody or skipping if someone wants to weigh in about something we've touched base on.
Well, let me first say, man, I'm so hungry now because I just start thinking about Afghani food and I'm like, oh, I almost love Afghani food as much as I love the humanities. Uh, and so to your point, as a literature major and as somebody, as a English and lit instructor at San Diego City College, I really believe that the humanities and some of the critical thinking that I was able to obtain, and the ability to kind of think through other people's perspectives, understand other perspectives, and in the process be able to develop and sometimes strengthen my own, was absolutely invaluable. And one of the things that we do try to figure out is, how do we bring that experience to the community? And that's under the understanding that often folks, every time I say, Brother Yusef, man, you messed up the word community for me, because every time I say community now, I feel like I'm doing something bad. But hopefully people will give me some grace in the use of the word. But that's not to say that people in the community aren't some of the most brilliant critical thinking minds that are out there. And capable, and not just capable, but engaged in doing some real world changing actions. But I can't help but always feel that so much of the gifts that I was able to benefit through higher education are being withheld from so many people who have to work full-time, raise children full-time, and do all of these things. And so, as one of the programs that we do, we try to do it yearly at different times, is our political education classes, right? And so taking, and most of the people, I don't think we've invited any math or STEM professors yet. No diss on them. But I think most of the people are actually connected to the humanities, and just being able to have those kind of thoughts around ideas, thoughts, issues that are happening, I think is absolutely valuable. So figuring out ways outside of the structures of higher education and how to bring those resources and tools to the larger community is definitely something that I think is really important, and that we're constantly struggling with.
I'd also like to say that we've had some really great opportunities with UCI's Humanities Out There program, and having fellowships with PhD students. And, the idea that there are other career pathways outside of academia for them was never a horizon for them that they thought about until getting the fellowship with us. And I think, highlighting opportunities for work in the community as career pathways, or even from the undergraduate side, right? Highlighting that there are career opportunities in the arts and humanities is so important for students to recognize. Yeah.
I noticed, in terms of who's with us today and who we are, that we have two people whose work really centrally, among other things, deals with questions of food, space, belonging, access, stories. And we have two organizations who are very heavily involved in work around mass incarceration, anti-police surveillance work, and those long histories of community resistance, popular resistance to policing. And it strikes me, listening and hearing a little bit from all four of you, that those two fields in particular, kind of food studies and carceral studies, have been really big fields in the humanities in the last, I don't know how many years. And I'm just curious if there's been any kind of scholarly activity that you feel like you've found really useful in thinking about whether it's political education you do for the people who are involved in your organizations, or things you recommend to people, or things that you have run across where you think, oh, that's pretty useful, or if that scholarship by and large has been disconnected from the everyday work that you do. And I'm not emotionally involved, invested in either answer. It's okay if the stuff is, disconnected and irrelevant, because that's part of the point also of our conversation. But I'm just curious about what, if anything, that's floating out there in the scholarly ether seems like it's been useful for you in the context or course of your own work.
Well, I'll just say it's absolutely disconnected, and it's not, right? Like, so I don't think that I would be able to think and I would be able to work and do what we do at Pillars had I not been able to benefit from a lot of the resources that were available to me in academia. But when it comes to like actual like scholarly work that's happening now around incarceration, not much of it. So sometimes it'll help with talking points, and that's kind of as far as it goes, except for the individuals, right? The individual scholars or the professors who are kind of experts in those areas who choose to become a part of the community. And often what they end up bringing is a sense of legitimacy to the concerns that the community is already experts in and has been voicing for a long time. So when I say that when I talk about racial profiling, when I talk about police brutality, it can easily be dismissed. But when we have somebody, who's, studying it from the universities who comes in and talks about those same things, all of a sudden elected officials, op-eds, newspapers, journalisms will take those things a lot more seriously. A really good example of that is Dr. Lily Irani, who I think is in communications, but it has a strong background in tech areas. And we found out, I'm trying to not talk too long. We found out a while ago that there were, thousands of quote unquote smart streetlights that were essentially going to be one of the largest surveillance systems in the country, were being put up all around San Diego. We learned about it. The more we learned about it, the scarier it was. And I'm like, shit, this is some scary shit. But it wasn't until we had Dr. Lily Irani, the Trust Coalition, and people who had more kind of an academic or scholarly background and understanding of technologies, that those concerns that we voiced were actually listened to and appreciated. And in fact, I was like, oh shit, this looks scary. And they came in and they're like, guess what? It's scarier than you think. And so whether we're dealing with kind of research around incarceration, whether dealing with tech surveillance and all of these other things, I think that the potential for scholarly work to be helpful really is contingent upon the scholars themselves actually having connections to the communities. And instead of focusing on their work and uplifting their work, they're focused on the communities and uplifting the work that's happening in the community itself.
In terms of your question, I think it's interesting because with carceral studies, we've definitely been informed and impacted by so many scholars, starting with Ruthie Gilmore and Dylan and Danny and Damien Sojourn. So many, like I would be leaving people out. The list is really long. But when we look at the peoples whose actual analysis in scholarship informs our work, they're all by scholars who have been committed for pretty much their whole life in the so-called community. Like they're very engaged. Not just as an academic exercise, but as kind of a life exercise of fighting carceral logics. And so their actual analysis is also very helpful then to our work. And the other part that begins to happen with these kinds of relationships is the kind of thievery, the theft and appropriation of diversity and inclusion. So because carcerality is hot now, there's a whole new wave of academics who have been profiting, winning so many awards and $100,000, like just millions of dollars, writing about people suffering, but don't have the same kinds of commitment and connection to communities in the way that other scholars do, but they're the ones that come along and get the shine. And so not only is it harmful to the scholars that have been doing the work for a long time, but it ends up being harmful for our communities. And that's the thing that becomes harder to deal with because other academics have a hard time addressing it because they're in that politic and we don't always have the same kind of information, et cetera. Like a lot of our partners will be like, yo, this book is trash. And everyone is citing this one book, but no one's talking publicly about, yo, this book is trash and it's not helpful to our communities. And so that's one way of part. How can we do things on the outside, so-called, that y'all can't do on the inside, and vice versa? How do we navigate those relationships? And lastly, just really quick on to say that I think it's important to talk about what can you teach students and what do we need? And we begin kind of talking about that. But along with that question is, what structures within the institution need to change to facilitate that, to make that even a remote possibility? So even the way that the university pays people, I was in a project, was working with a lot of women that were recently from Mexico, and they would get paid to be part of this community program, and the university would mail her check and her husband would steal her check. And so we're telling the university like, yo, you can't mail her check because her husband's stealing it and she's the one doing the work. And they're like, well, we can't change our policies. So they kept mailing her the check, knowing that it got stolen. And so there's all these ways in which the very structures of the university are set up to impede community relationships and partnerships, particularly with communities that are very criminalized. And so along with what do we need, we have to begin asking what needs to change in the academy to facilitate that process.
Christine and Anchi, I'm wondering if you have thoughts on this or related questions.
I think from the food scholarship, it's just a very different world. I think my perspective and experience, it's I think that I see the academy as being really important for generating research. So over the last 10 years, 20 years, food systems and food has become just everywhere. And I think it's just because of the nature of food. And that's why we use it to teach ESL and job skills, is because everyone has a connection to food. But now it has climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, where 10 years ago, we didn't have any data on the food systems. And I sat on the San Diego's climate action plan and there was no data. So I think that I see the impact in much more kind of tangible ways about the food system. And I see another piece where it has to do with just, I think, being able to popularize, like Michael Pollan has done a lot to just popularize very basic concepts about the industrial food system. And so I think it's been helpful to take these, very important scientific ideas and then translate them into policy, but then it takes from policy to translating it into prose, right? Like his maxim is, eat mostly plants, not a lot of meat. Like so many people have changed their lifestyle as a result of that. And so just think a little bit more about how, good prose and good research has translated to ways that people like me on the ground can actually communicate and do our work a bit more easily.
Yeah, and to echo that, as you know, the Vietnamese American community here in the United States is very young. So we are lucky to have really great scholars and academics in the field doing the research, but there is still so much to be recorded. There's a lot of oral history projects that need to be done and recorded. We have great scholars like Dr. Linda Vo, Dr. Yen Espiritu and Thuy Vo Dang out there on the grounds writing the books, doing the work to add to the repertoire that is available to students to research, but we still need more. And part of our expertise as an organization is having the connections, the networks of artists, and where we need assistance is helping record all of that in a way that is useful for academia and working together with those types of opportunities.
We have a couple of really interesting questions in the Q&A that speak to some of what we were talking about. So I wanted to just put a couple of them out there. And two of them in particular are interesting because they kind of ask a related question, but from really different perspectives. Haley asks, what would you suggest students who are partnering with your organization or others do to make sure our time is valuable and doesn't seem transactional? I cherish the opportunities we get to work with organizations outside of the university, and I want to make sure my work is as valuable as possible. So I'd like to take that question up, but I'd also invite each of you to share, if you're interested in this, maybe an organization that you got started working with when you were kind of on the other side of things, maybe a student or just coming out of the space of being a student or in that age bracket of student life where you kind of sort of came into the position from the position that maybe some of our audience is in. And then Dylan has a question about how to kind of restrict, to do a little bit of the work, I think, Yusef, you touched on about how to change the operations of the university in a way that makes these interactions less colonial, to use another loaded term. So why don't we take Haley's question up about students first, and then we'll move on.
Briefly to Haley's point, I mean, I think like any other types of relationships, the key is kind of the terms that you enter into it with, right? Like, despite, I don't know what what you're studying, what your emphasis is, or what your interest in, but any particular grassroots organization that you go in, I think, again, the importance is, how can you learn and assist as opposed to teach and lead? And I think that's just as true for students as it is for faculty, right? Like sometimes we see faculty members who kind of parachute into the community and view themselves as these kind of saviors who understand the issues better than the people who are actually impacted by it. And so instead of using their skills, their knowledge, and their research to support what's happening, they try to put themselves into a very kind of hierarchical position. And I think students can often fall into that same trap too, right? Like, hey, I took a class on this and I know this and I read that book. And so let me go tell these folks how they should be doing. So, I mean, I would just enter it, whatever kind of volunteer work or whatever organizations you try to be in touch with, enter it with humility and give it the same amount of care, love, and attention that you would give it to any relationship that you want to be successful.
And to that question, I would say, one is context specific. So what's good for one relationship or one organization is going to be different for another. So in terms of giving like specific, here's the steps you need to do, that's difficult. But in general, I would almost say make the relationship more transactional, particularly if you're a student. Students are not there for a long time, then they come, and in general, why people come into the community is for that kind of affective, visceral, like I want to be in the hood and I want to see colored people and I want to be around poverty or whatever. And then we don't get any benefit of it. And it's like, rather than worry about like building the relationship and like, yes, we want things centered in love and all that, but like help, like do something that's needed. And that might even be just doing using all the databases and technology you have on campus to do research for and with our communities, or any number of things of which we can appropriate some of those resources that are on campus that have been taken from us. And so I think that's a big one, is like, there's a lot of faculty that will come and say, oh, this program is free, and won't mention they got a $300,000 grant for the program, but supposedly it's free for our community. And so just being more transparent and figuring out what is needed rather than trying to be friendly, which, yeah, that's great, but we need help for real, not like we don't need more friends.
Yeah, I'll just add that for our organization, we know that it takes a lot of time to manage a volunteer. So we don't create volunteer opportunities that we don't need. And any of the attitudes that Khalid talked about, like if no one's gonna make it through an interview, if anyone's coming at it with any bit of like arrogance, or I mean, humility is definitely what we're gonna be screening for, and just a very open learning attitude and respectful attitude. So so I don't worry about that, because no one's gonna make it past an interview. And then I would say that once you're there, once you're here, it's really about being flexible and being as, we created a position because we need that help, but we're on the ground running an operation that changes, that's dynamic, that has 20 different variables. So, whatever we're asking of a volunteer to do is for a reason. And so if you can just approach being helpful and being flexible and not too fixed with, I came in to learn this and this is what you said 16 weeks ago. And, that I think is a kind of flexibility we expect from all our staff, on the job, and is an important job, trait for any job down the road too. So I would just say that volunteers are no different. But if you approach it with respect and humility, and you really just go and do the work now to learn about like which organization really speaks to you and you resonate with, there's some passion, you've read everything on their website, you've stalked them on everything in Google and social media, and you just feel like this is you, then I think you're going to come into that relationship, really like intentional and thoughtful, and that will be received, with like deep gratitude as well. And I think that that's probably one step to make sure that you're doing right, by your engagement.
Yeah, I would say coming in with an open mind and curiosity as well, trying to be curious about why is this role important to this nonprofit organization right now? Why is the role even created? And trying to ask questions and look forward to complex answers, and being creative and trying to think of ways where your experience as a student may help impact the community and impact the nonprofit organization as well. If you signed up for a particular role, what skills can you bring? What questions do you want to have answered, and what things do you need as a student that you want to learn from our organization? Are some things that I always ask our interns and fellows as they come in to work with us.
There's a really, I think, powerful comment in the Q&A, and I wanted to acknowledge it. Flower Alvarez Lopez has posted a couple of things, including a big up to you, Khalid, about your work bridging this kind of gap and making education accessible to community folks, but also offers the reminder that food justice and mass incarceration are directly connected, and that what maybe seemed like a space of distinction I was creating really should be collapsed. And so I think that's really important to acknowledge and to say. There's also a question here about how your organization conducts community needs assessments, and how you figure out from your own folks, your people around, what directions you're going in, what new projects you decide to take up, where you feel like maybe it's important, but you don't have the capacity or the particular folks on board to do that kind of work. Just generally, what's your own process about how you decide what you know about the community that you're living in, working in, and serving. And then Shelley and Dylan's questions I want to get to too, but I do think this is a really interesting one about your own process of assessment of what you are seeing and living around you. Whether that's new communities that are coming into a place like San Diego who might have different experiences or needs, or Yusef, in your case, kind of shifting the organization from principally an archive aimed at scholars to something focused on the people who live around the physical building and how to serve them better, or in any way that you kind of go into that knowledge gathering process on your own.
Well, in terms of food deserts, I think is a good one of how some of this plays out, because we actually do political education workshops on the notion of food deserts, which is a very neoliberal construct that kind of says like, oh, there's no healthy food and the problem is access, that we don't have grocery stores. And so they try to pass legislation that creates deregulation so that grocery stores will be incentivized to build in so-called low-income communities. So they get tax incentive. So it becomes this very public-private partnership as a solution for the fact that we don't have enough healthy food to eat. And so like Michelle Obama was promoting this stuff. And at the same time, the Obama administration was cutting food stamp allotments for families. And they were investing hundreds of millions of dollars into the notion of food deserts to deregulate to incentivize supermarket building in our communities. And there's a very clear relationship between campus and communities in re-articulating these notions of what the problem is. And the problem is a market-based one. And so it would be really helpful if people in the campus side would help make these things, make the what food deserts are and the kind of language and construction of it more legible to our communities, because our communities understand very viscerally and immediately that, yes, we don't have enough healthy places to eat, and maybe it's racist, but that's what we get sold. And then we're sitting there carrying the water for the supermarket industry. And so having more support, because what happens is the university will bring nonprofits in the community that will tell this foundation line about we need more access, we need more places to consume, and then they'll be celebrated and legitimated on campus as opposed to critiqued. And so that's a very clear example of like where where the campus could help. In terms of your last question, very quickly, one thing that we did was people in our neighborhood, so-called gang members, actually designed and collected a survey of over 200 people in the local neighborhood about what their needs are, organized a community barbecue, all this stuff, shared the findings, and wanted to begin organizing to change conditions in the community. We couldn't get any financial support for it. People kept being incarcerated, didn't have a place to live, all this stuff. And then all these millions of dollars were invested, particularly with UCLA and other universities, to come in and do so-called community assessment of the same neighborhood in partnership with the police to develop a community policing partnership. And so all these universities and nonprofits and Black Lives Matter supported this policing project in our neighborhood, and the so-called gang members had already done it. And we have things like the Black Lives Matter LA, they'll performatively get arrested. And then when they're in jail, they be like, well, Dr. So-and-so PhD shouldn't be in jail. And so everyone's trying to get them out. Meanwhile, all the other Black people that ain't got no PhD is sitting there with no love and nobody advocating. And then these same people get celebrated on campuses as the leaders of Black movements and not critiqued for the kind of anti-Blackness behavior that they're doing. And so anticipating some of Dylan's question is like, we got to start naming these things in both locations, in community so-called settings and on campus, actually name the scholars, name the projects that are harming our communities.
I'll just mention something that I've experienced related to the food desert conversation Yusef just brought up. And it's something that kind of I experienced for maybe the first 5 years of my whole time working at IRC in City Heights, which was, the Michelle Obama, had just come to visit our garden. Food access, food security was a big deal. But what I saw on the ground in City Heights was a lot of supermarkets. They weren't any of the chain supermarkets. They were actually started, operated by immigrant, refugee entrepreneurs, a lot of Vietnamese supermarkets that had culturally appropriate, affordable, maybe it was an all certified organic, and same in El Cajon, a lot of Iraqi markets. And so it was just this weird disconnect that I experienced. I don't think I had any time or bandwidth to critique, the discrepancy between what I experienced on the ground and what I was seeing, in the literature and the grants and the knowledge. But I just kind of, present that back out to you all to think about how those definitions and how the experience of people working on the ground in the nonprofit sector and in organizations can have a 180-degree difference in terms of what is happening and what truth is and isn't. Not to say
Ralph's desert is not a food desert, in other words.
Right. And so, and you'd be putting out all those businesses, like with competition. And so there's some other economic impacts. So I just, that was a very personal experience professionally for a while. But I would also, I think I forgot my train of thought because this was about, I wanted to just share that, but there was like another question about, wasn't there? Okay, forget it. Just I'll leave it at that.
That's my fault for interrupting. Christine, I saw
how
you
to do community assessment.
Oh, community assessments. Yeah, we just talk to people. I mean, it's not so, sometimes it's a survey, sometimes it's a poll. Most times it's just having very personal relationships with the people we we serve and empower from beginning to end, and really getting to know. And again, kind of like the undercurrent here is it's nuanced, it's diverse. You know, you don't say Iraqi, Afghan women need this, you know, it's very different. And as you form these different relationships, you'll hear themes or you'll hear differences, and we're very responsive to our, you know, to our clients. And so I think that that's just a very simple, straightforward way that we do community needs assessments and stay accountable to what we do and how we, you know, use our resources and design programming.
Yeah, and I would echo, you know, holding space for the way in which we do community assessments. Sometimes the NPO might not be staffed, might be volunteer run. So we can't do a survey as deeply as you know, someone from the university might be able to complete it. And so holding space for recordings and having deep interpersonal conversations directly with the community is going to be really important to note as we're assessing community needs.
Khalid, you want to touch on that question?
You know, Pillars isn't like a typical organization in that sense. We kind of think of this is going to sound kind of made up or self-aggrandizing, but we kind of consider ourselves like a part of the community. So, you know, I live two blocks from, excuse me, I live a few blocks from our office. Most of our staff is from Southeast, formerly incarcerated, and are, you know, born and raised in this area. And so the needs and assessments, there's not really like a needs and assessment tool. It's more of kind of what's happening now. And so if anything, the needs and assessments tool is building community. So creating events where the community can come together and know each other and talk and eat and work on different things. And out of those relationships, things will present themselves. And so the thing that is kind of the most upfront and center is clearly the targeting of Black and brown folks by law enforcement. And then what happens is nuances pop up on how that looks. So we have a participatory defense hub that works with people who have a loved one going through the judicial system. And so we'll find out, for example, Floor, who's is a really good example of Flower, who's asked the question earlier, is a really good example of somebody was at Cal State San Marcos, was involved in the National Latino Research Center, and totally connected with the community. Like that's everything that scholarship and academia should be encouraging. Heard that there was somebody who the district attorney was trying to get a sign a waiver saying that along with their plea deal, if any laws changed that would make their sentence less, that they wouldn't be able to benefit from those laws in the future. So because of that relationship, we were able to reach out to a journalist who then did a report on it, which a assembly member or a senator, I can't remember, ended up writing a bill and addressing those issues. So again, having those real relationships with the communities that you're a part of, in the same way that Brother Yusef was talking about having gang members, you know, I would imagine that most of the information they were getting from was based on actual relationships and people that they knew from the neighborhood, you know, and neighborhoods that they were, you know, had deep roots in. And so that's really, it's an organic process, and not us kind of, I'm not saying that this is how other people do it, but not like a checklist of needs and assessment issues. They just kind of come to the surface, and we're flexible enough to be able to, for the most part, address those issues.
Let me jump in there and do so just by saying two things. First of all, We have a list of resources connected to our conversation, both the organizations and institutions that participated, but others as well. You can find that. We'll drop it back into the chat, but as well, it's on our iah.ucsd.edu website. You'll find a link to it. So please check that out. Otherwise, in the 90 seconds or so that we have left, I want to just take a second again to thank Anchi and Christine and Yusef and Khalid for being with us, to thank as well Kathleen, Nancy, and Judy for the institutional help and support from UC Riverside, UC Irvine, and UC San Diego, to thank Saribel for her work compiling the resource list, and Ana Marie for hosting and putting together the web infrastructure for our event. I hope this will be the first of many conversations, but more importantly, I hope it will be the first of more intense and useful and positive collaborations. I want to echo Yusef's comment that we want to blur these distinctions which no longer serve to delineate something actual, but serve maybe instead to impede our own work of transforming the university in some of the ways Dylan pointed to, and our own work in making sure that the community can help us transform our own spaces, just as some of us are trying to help shift the worlds that we live in when we're not at work. So I want to thank everyone again and wish you a safe, happy, and above all, revolutionary 2022. Hope to see all of you in the streets instead of on the screens. And be well, be safe, and forwards ever.